What a fascinating evening, at least in India, and morning for many of you. Uh, Brilliant set of conversations. Lovely to learn every day so much more. The journey is very new. Journey of digital public infrastructure is new, as the first panelist was talking about. While the internet and GPS and so on, we sort of know, we have not been repeating that, and it's not straightforward to think like that at that scale. But I think in the last decade, few countries, including India, has shown that this can be done. And definitely, um, the previous Linda was mentioning in the previous panel about the sustainability of this and the importance of private sector. So even India's much of the DPIs, private sector was active participants of building it, designing it, building it, and innovating on top of it. And so there is, it's not private versus government or inclusion versus innovation. It can be a combination of all that. And that's what DPI approach has clearly shown, that it is possible to bring market, governments, and civil society and together to build shared digital rails on top of which many solutioning can happen and do reusable building blocks and so on, right? That we heard much of that conversation. So I'm delighted to have a fantastic set of leaders from the private sector. And I'll do a quick introduction, and I'll ask all of you to come on video. I can't see you. In case you're on video, it's perfect. So we have Shalini, who is the President and Chief Technologist at AWS India, Dr. Rohini Srivatsa, National Technology Officer, CTO of Microsoft India, and from joining from Singapore. I know it's late, Alistair. Thanks for joining from Oracle Cloud. And all these are hyperscalers or cloud, massive cloud providers, on top of which a very large ecosystem of innovations already happen around the world. And some of the India's DPIs run on their cloud as well. So it's amazing that it is a good, combination both. We also have two leaders from the consulting world. NSN Murthy, who is a partner and leader of government and public services at Deloitte, and someone who has been part of the early days of Aadhaar onwards, who's Rakesh Kaul, who is the partner at Ernst & Young, EY, India. So delighted to have all of you. Very much looking forward to hearing. But I want to also introduce Dr. Rudra Chowdhury, who's going to be moderating. I'm not going to be moderating. I'll have them have a blast. And Rudra is a director at Carnegie, and I love the way he has brought a lot of DPI thinking together, not only India and even in the US and around the world. So Rudra, off to you. Looking forward to listening.
Thanks, Pramod. And what a fantastic panel. I'm keeping an eye on the clock because I realized that we've only got about 40 minutes. Someone's stolen 5 minutes from us, but we'll make up. So what I thought I'd do is just divide this discussion into two parts. So perhaps the first part, we can talk a little bit about the relationship between markets, the private sector, and DPI. And in the second part, maybe get a little bit granular about DPI deployment, the role of the private sector, and if there are different ways of doing deployment. So as far as the first, and I thought hard about trying to soft belly the questions, but I thought let me just get to it. I think Alice in the last panel talked about the importance of the private sector. As Pramod said, clearly in the way in which India has developed its DPI journey, the private sector is absolutely crucial. But yet, now with all that mobilization with the G20, there are joint statements between India and a range of other countries. There's stuff going on in terms of global DPI that Brazil is thinking about, Singapore's thinking about. There's a lot of concern that is emerging among private sector globally in terms of, hey, listen, where do we sit when it comes to the global DPI agenda? So let me ask one broad question to everybody, and then perhaps we can nuance it a little bit. Is there's a growing perception or a pretty strong perception in some quarters that DPI is anti-private sector. If I could just get your views each on this before we start. Perhaps we could start with Rohini.
Sure, thanks. I think the perception, I'm not sure where it is coming from, but I think it's very important to remember that the whole idea of putting together public infrastructure is for the economy to grow. And if you're looking for just the government or the public sector to grow the economy, you've lost the entrepreneurial and economic energy of the entire society. So I think fundamentally, even though from the beginning it might appear that the word public in DPI might throw you off, but at the end of the day, it is about ensuring that you're putting together the rails and roads and infrastructure for the private sector to innovate, and that is the real prime mover, real non-linear growth that an economy really achieves.
Okay. If I can just push you, Rohini, before I just move, just very quickly. I mean, you're at Microsoft. Microsoft has been one of the lead organizations when it comes to trying to understand compacts with DPI, at least in India. Globally, are you thinking about similar compacts in different parts of the world with different kinds of DPI frameworks?
So look, I think the concept of DPIs, to be honest, is something that organizations like Microsoft are learning about. From a concept perspective, the fact that we're a platform company, it is natural to us. It is natural to provide the building blocks to build applications. That's what platform companies do. But I think the more recent, over the last 6 months, 1 year, the understanding of how India has grown, how India has developed our technology stack, and then globally, how DPIs have actually been there. There are DPIs all around the world. That understanding is now growing. And I think that that closure of both our own DNA and the way DPI and DPGs are growing is the path we are on right now.
Thanks, Rohini. Maybe I could just switch to Alistair and to just get your views on this kind of broad and somewhat piercing question.
Sure, Rudra. And firstly, let me say thank you to the organisers just for the opportunity to attend this. It's such an incredible group of people tonight or from my night, that's been having this conversation. So thank you at the outset. For me and for Oracle, we take a counter view on this, Rudra. We think really this is bringing a new market and new market opportunities to the private sector. Yep, we're a hyperscaler cloud. We've got presence around the world, which can be used for that. And data really is our DNA. And so as this comes on board and is adopted by more nations, we can support that adoption, the ecosystem. The private sector can get on board with new initiatives, deployment models, financing models, many different ways. So I really think it's a fundamental mindset shift that the private sector sort of needs to go through to adopt this. It's no longer buying swathes of software or equipment necessary. It's just a new mindset of how we adopt it and support it and deploy it.
Alistair, if I could ask one question is, we had 2 very thick panels and a fantastic discussion with the DPI entrepreneur. Well, 2 DPI entrepreneurs, I should say, Pramod and Mr. Nilikani. Do you feel sometimes that in the private sector, there's a bit of a divide between the very rich DPI ecosystem that's about 10 or 15 years old and the role of the private sector? Because, if you hear Leave speaking at DPJ, they've got thinking about standards. There are at least 2 dozen organizations in the DPI kind of infrastructure that think about principles. A lot of that has been baked into this kind of G20 outcome document run by the DWG. So is there a gap necessarily, and is there more that needs to be done to bridge that gap?
Is there a gap? Perhaps there's a gap, but I think that really is hand in glove or a handoff. You do need the standards, you do need the principles, you need the private sector then to take that forward and help with the implementation and the instantiation of that. There's still a lot more we need to learn about this, Rudra. So I think that's where the gap is. I think as we work together and collaborate, perhaps more so in the definition of standards and principles and deployment options, and then roll out through the deployment phase and the continuous development and innovation of this, I think we can do a lot more together.
Okay. On the point of doing more together, before I turn to Shalini, perhaps I could bring in are two very different selves. Maybe NSN and Rakesh. Maybe I'll start with NSN on the broad question of DPI as anti-private sector, but also perhaps a little bit with your kind of very clear kind of consulting hat on is how do we now start merging these different communities? Because at the end of the day, if we're talking about global DPI deployment, we're talking about 100 countries, 150 countries, each of these countries with very different ecosystems, very different local ecosystems, very different politics. You've got 100 countries with populations of less than 5 million, but then you've got some very large countries wanting to do DPI. So maybe you can just touch on both these points.
Thanks. So, and thanks for inviting me on the panel. So on the first question, I think I'll
Listen, I don't know if it's me, but your voice is a little bit muffled. Maybe we could just turn to Rakesh and then come back to NSN, if that's okay. Maybe Rakesh.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rudra, and thank you, organizers, for this wonderful opportunity to be part of this conversation. It's been fascinating to hear all the right stakeholders talking about DPI. So thank you so much. As regards this question, Rudra, last year, it was Madhukar and Liv to an we started talking about the role of private sector for the rollout of these DPIs. And that question really nudged me to understand this better. And what is the role that consultants are playing? What is the role large SIs are playing? And that led to an exercise where we did some research about what is the potential that DPGs hold for private sector. And after a thorough study and meeting a lot of stakeholders in the private sector, the outcome really surprised me and perhaps a lot of stakeholders within EY. It took us some time to really throw this number out and convince a lot of stakeholders that the research really supports this number. And the number is about, an annual market of about 100 billion by 2030. And when you look at that number, you really realize that this movement is not about just siloed approaches here and there. It's not just about developing countries. It's also about developed countries. It was, heartening to see that US has about 34 odd deployed digital public goods. UK has about 23 of them. India has about 47 of them. So it's something which has been there, but maybe it's not been talked about as openly. It didn't have a forum to talk about. So therefore, as we ourselves also realize the potential of this, obviously, we then put all our ducks in a row to see how best we can leverage this opportunity of DPGs and DPIs. But to answer your question, you have two questions in it. One, basis our conversations with all of these stakeholders in the private sector, I think everybody very clearly understood and realized and appreciated the benefits that DPIs bring to communities, governments, and businesses. But I think certain sections, which I would specifically say, could be the application OEMs, to an extent were a little apprehensive about the short-term effect or impact of DPIs or DPGs on the business. But in the long term, I think they did realize and appreciate that this is a government technology trend which is going to stay and increase over a period of time as the adoption, collaboration between countries, the funding institutes synergize around it. So this is a trend which is going to remain. So what in my conversations with all of these companies is happening is that they're going back to their drawing board. They're saying that, hey, this is a trend which is going to stay. What that means is that we need to look at solutions which encompass this trend. And we also look at revenue models which take this trend into account. So therefore, I, in summary and nutshell, can say that all the private sector is really excited about it. Some of us are back to the drawing board and saying that, look, hey, this is what is going to happen. How are we going to leverage it the most? And how are we going to deliver the impact to the best possible avenues that we have? So I think that's in nutshell, as I believe, as private sector. The other part of your question was that how can we bring it together or something like that was the other part of the question that you put out. In my sense, there are three key priorities which come out, Rudra, in sum and substance that, as I believe. One is how do we increase the collaboration amongst countries around this whole DPI, DPG? The other is how do we synergize between the funding organizations? Because a lot of philanthropic fund, a lot of organized funding is getting into it, and it's all siloed. Everybody wants to contribute and contribute in the best way that they see possible. And this also leads to the question of how can there be a dedicated governance around this whole DPI. I'm talking now of individual DPIs because they otherwise come, there's no single body which is responsible for it as they evolve and a community-led evolution. And last is how do you make access available to easy access to people who can deploy it? You need expertise at the end. So collaboration between countries, synergized funding, and availability to expertise. What that brings me to a point, Rudra, is, and that's for everybody, for us to deliberate, is there a need for a three-sided marketplace to be developed for DPIs, which at one end has, the demand side is triggered by implementers, which is the governments and the developers. The second side is the supply side of it, which is the technology providers. And the third leg of this marketplace could be the finance, people who are funding it. If we are able to get to this marketplace and get this going, I think a lot of siloed approach or siloed initiatives that are happening will synergize. A lot of sharing will happen. So in my belief, that's one thing which I believe can really excite and catalyze this whole movement forward. Thank you.
No, thanks, Rakesh. That's a lot to chew on. I think this kind of triangle of demand, supply, finance is a really nice framework, and perhaps we can spend a little bit of time trying to unpick that framework in this conversation itself. But maybe I could turn back to NSN.
Yeah. Is my voice audible? So is it better now?
This is good.
Yeah. Okay.
That sounds great.
Okay. So while Rakesh has taken the thunder out of my answer, okay. So let me actually put it in a same way which Rakesh has mentioned on the first one, the private sector. I think exactly what Rakesh has said, that there's always going to be a little bit of apprehension when there is a disruption in the ecosystem, which is brought in by technology, which in itself will not create a license value or a dollar value from the licenses. Okay, so let's look at two parts. Even today, the developed countries are not onto the license infrastructure. Not on the open source infrastructure. So when you actually take an open source infrastructure, which has either what do you call a free or a kind of a quasi-commercial impact, then the people who are system integrators and OEMs will always have the first tough time in first few years. Okay, so that's evident from the.
Sorry. Yeah, no, now you're fine. You're back. Yeah.
So that's evident from the overall perspective. So but I think disruption is something inbuilt into every technology firm. Every product firm would like to actually see the disruption is changed from a challenge to an opportunity. And I think that's what is happening. And a little bit of evidence is in this panel itself. 3 of us are from the technology side and 2 of us are from the consulting side. On private sector, we're talking about DPI and DPGs with a great amount of passion, right? So I think it's more to do with how fast we learn to monetize the assets which are created through this entire journey, and how can we replicate it faster to various countries, cities, or the ministries. I think business by the private sector will happen and is happening today after a little bit of what we call kind of a testing phase for all of us. So that's the part one. So because there has to be an honest acceptance that the open source API did disrupt a lot of models. Okay, that's part one. Part two of the story is how does the governments across or the smaller entities, smaller nations will adopt these and learn this. I think I'll go a little bit delta X plus one on what Rakesh has said is what we need beyond the demand supply and the finance part of Rudra is I think a kind of a catalyst motion, because what is required is actually first is a behavioral part of it. is an acceptance. How do I accept something which is not a product, which is not given by a brand? Okay, so because we always believe advertising and marketing sells branding products first. Okay, so it's that notion. So I think something which is not branded. Okay, so when I say branded, it doesn't mean a kind of that. I'm just saying that there's a sense of an esteem if you actually procure a kind of a solution coming from a large entity. Now you're actually taking a DPG which is deployed in a country or a B country or C country, and you're not taking it. Okay, that's part one. So how do you actually change the behavioral aspect? And that behavioral aspect is at the leadership level at the country. So therefore, it is a catalyst motion which needs to be the first one as the tip of the arrow, which should enable the leadership capacity development and thereby leading a conversation between the private sector in that country and the government entities to ensure that there is a smooth transition of these infrastructure and products into the country. So I think the leadership comes first, which needs to actually go through this notion and accept that. See a lot of that happening today, but I think that happening beyond the N-1 from a prime minister to a next level minister and the bureaucracy, that's one of the most important elements.
No, thanks, Anas. And I should just say that I think your volume still going up and down, but I think we're trying to take in the best that we can. And I'm sure everyone's making the best of the puzzle that NSN's throwing at us. I should just say before I turn to Shalini, there are some very interesting questions in the Q&A box. So if you just want to open it up and have a look at it, and I could kind of come back to it. There's especially one on legacy systems and the kind of frictions of trying to replace legacy systems. But Shalini, your kind of broad views.
Yeah, sure. So essentially, your question on public and private and the perception being there. See, the whole DPI is put forward by countries because they want to do societal platforms. They want to do digital innovation around some of the bigger societal problems. And all the countries and governments are very similar in nature when they want to solve whether land records or driving license or ID cards. So there is a lot of similarity on the problems that they are wanting to solve. And they want to do it for the society, which means they are going to cater to millions or billions of citizens. And that means there is scale. And scale is one place where the private entities bring it in the best form possible because they have time tested it. They roll it out. I mean, today from a cloud perspective at AWS, we do feature updates on in a minute basis. So these things are proven, and that helps in bringing a lot of benefit to the governments that a private partnership will bring the scale. And the second part is security. All the governments are talking about security, about confidentiality, about sovereignty. Now, the tools which are provided by the private entities are time tested again for providing those security and making it available for the countries as when it is possible. Now, the question comes, and why this perception happens is because essentially they say that what is it which is repeatable? Is it a product which is repeatable? And the governments want it as an open source repeatable solution. So for open source repeatable solution, there has to be a lot of attempt to make the patterns, the toolkits, the prototypes, and the methodologies that you have to put together. So the private organizations have a lot of onus to bring out those repeatable part which can be taken by all the countries and then developed at that place. So I don't think the public can do without a private, or even a private can actually test the societal problems that they are. So it's a beautiful marriage, I would say, which should happen and which should see the light of the day.
Okay. Again, keeping an eye on the clock, I had another kind of market private sector question, but perhaps I'll park that. I just want to move to deployment. And Shalini, just to say on your point, what we found quite interesting is in the DWG outcome document for the digital ministers, in the definition of DPI, what's interesting, it says not just open source, it says it could also be proprietary, which is a big shift in the negotiations that, it started off in February and where we ended up. And obviously, a lot of these negotiations is about compromise in trying to actually get a consensus. but it was interesting that was actually placed there. There's a big section on market, innovation, and growth built into the kind of DPI framework. Let me kind of switch now to deployment. It's a big challenge. There's all this G20 momentum. There is a range of countries that are now thinking about, can I deploy to 20 countries? Can India deploy to 30 countries? Leave talked about the kind of 50 in 5 years. And there's obviously a demand. There are countries that have a demand for particular sort of systems. They don't necessarily always understand that this is a kind of value proposition, not just a kind of a technology feature, but nonetheless, there is a kind of a big demand. How do we do deployment which is more agile, nimble-footed, keeps in mind the capacity of a lot of the demand side, right? A lot of the demand side is countries with low state capacity, right? So you've got some countries with high state capacity, you've got some large countries, 100 million population and more, right? And then you've got a lot of countries which is kind of under the 10, 15, 20 million population kind of scale. So just to get your general views, there's a traditional way of maybe doing deployment, which is your typical procurement, RFPs, big line of credit. Is there a different way of doing deployment? And, maybe I could start with two of our access provider experts in the room and then move backwards. Is there a cloud solution? Is there a way in which we can do a fully packaged, fully hosted, fully downloadable, plug-and-play version of DPI, not just in one jurisdiction, but maybe in time and clusters of jurisdictions? So let me do it the other way around. Maybe start with Shalini, then move to Alistair, and then come down.
Yeah, sure. So, a short answer would be that cloud is the way to do it, right? Because that's the shortest answer, because there is no other way where you can make 50 in 5 years possible. You're talking about multiple countries with different processes. You're talking about different policies and you did mention about the RFP and the procurement. So when you have to deploy in a very fast manner, there are certain essential principles that we need to have. The first is the technology. Second is, and I'll explain that a bit more. The second is the policy part of it, and policy includes all the procurement RFPs, etc., that you talked about. And third is actually the implementation hassles which you will face in the country, because they are diverse in nature and they are varied in nature. So going back to the first is that the technology enables, because it can make migration happen faster. Like, for example, when we did DigiLocker was like, X amount of, data which is there. And within 2 months, moving a huge amount of data and having the documents and in a secure manner, all that available was not an easy job. But then suppose, a new country comes up and it says that I want to be live in like three months. So that means that, their data is going to be there in legacy systems. You need to do migrations. You need to bring them onto the cloud. You need to also make them available at all the times. So they need a region in their specific country. And it was also possible that they don't have any cloud region and they want to ride on to some of the cloud regions which might be present in other regions which are highly available and highly present. So the scalability, the availability, the ease of bringing it, and the cost of ownership going down because of the cloud deployment. Because every time, we all know in a traditional model, the whole install, the base, and, putting all the software together, it takes a while. But in cloud, the heavy lifting is all taken away from you. So the technology is the biggest enabler, which can make this whole cycle much faster. The second part is the policy part, and there have been mechanisms like, there are governments like Singapore and Australia who have whole of government agreements in place, whereas, they put a whole procurement mechanisms, and they put a mechanism, and then it is up to the departments to, not even have an RFP, just deploy the solutions which they want with a set of empaneled hyperscalers. So it avoids a big time chunk which goes away in the whole RFP process. And the third is, of course, the implementation partners. And I think there also it makes a lot of difference, because as AWS, we have our implementation partners in almost all the countries. We work with them. In fact, We have some 140 open government solutions which are available, with, you know, some from Mexico, some from, I'm not taking India because India is there, but, you know, other countries like Africa, all of them are available, and those become a base, and implementation partners can then quickly use their own methods and technologies to make that solution successful. So it's a three-legged thing when it comes to deployment, and cloud would be the right way to make it faster.
And just to be clear, is just a short answer is, so your view is that if you created a model which was fully packaged end to end, licensing, security protocols, specs, governance, institution, and you had to deliver it to, say, lack of better terms, smaller countries, this could actually be done on the cloud in fairly rapid speed, keeping migration, etc., in mind over the next, say, 3 to 6 months.
Absolutely. And it is
Okay.
packaged because, you know, you don't have to care about the infrastructure, you don't have to care about the bundling of services, the APIs, the entire toolkit is available, and and the prototypes are available for the government to experiment and see and run it for some time.
Alistair, your views on this, and if I could just ask you to just think a little also about sustainability. So that's come up in some of the discussions that we've had, which is that, look, huge cloud build out, that's great, but how sustainable is this going forward? And as you can imagine, jurisdictions like the European Union are a little concerned about this.
Yeah, Rudra, I think that's a very key point, and Shalini has raised some very good points there on cloud, and would say exactly the same. Going one step further and say, we engineered our cloud so we can deploy this rapidly. We drop them out every 28 days, including clouds within countries' own data center where they don't have a public cloud region. So that offers, or that supports the sovereignty of data. Now, when you look at this, I look at, you've got a core system you've got to implement. Shalini's covered that really well. Each country has their own regulations, right? So they're going to need to be addressed. I think what I lean to here is a bit of a cadre staff approach, where you have a group of people who are experts in deploying this DPI and then influencing it or implementing the nuances of each regulation. And they can do that with the country that it's there. You talked before about the country not having the scale of people. And that's true in a lot of the countries we're working with. They're not enabled to do this kind of rollout, this capability. That cadre staff can then help build that ecosystem in the country, which then takes it forward into that sustainment model, because sustainment is critical. There are so many projects that have gone live successfully on day one, but fall over in the future because they're not sustained properly. And that we really have to focus on a lot in this space. 50 in 5 years is a big target. If in the 6th year, 40 of those fall over, then I think we've failed jointly. And we have to avoid that by scaling that ecosystem around this.
Thanks, Alistair. That kind of segues quite nicely to Rakesh and then to NSN before I come back to Rohini. So Rakesh, if you could give your thoughts on kind of deployment, and perhaps if I could ask you to touch on one or two key points is, you know, our sense and kind of talking to a variety of people is that in the end, what you really want is donors, SIs, DPG assets, and the private sector as a whole to follow essentially, say, one of 5 different deployment models across the world. So ideally, I mean, I don't think it'll ever happen, but ideally you don't want fragmentation, because the lack of fragmentation is what gives rise to market incentives in this space. Some people will be access providers, some will do SIs, some will do local SIs, some will do implementation, some will work out packaging, etc. Right? But you know, you've been in this game a lot. It's political. It's difficult in different jurisdictions. So how do we package and deploy DPI at scale in an agile way that is rapid, whether it's through the cloud, but also make clear that local conditionalities are taken care of? And some of that will be packaged, but I'm guessing there'll be frictions between what you package in a kind of a outline and the realities on the ground.
Thank you, Rudra. That's a fantastic question. And I think I'll just come back and share with my experience that was there when we, took MOSIP to the first country, Morocco. I think the first and foremost bedrock of this is the trust that the buyer has in this system. And from where does this trust emanate? Who do they trust? If it is a community-led software, it's available, and we say, hey guys, you download and start implementing. And the cloud providers make it available to them. Still, the trust deficit needs to be covered. And that's where I think the private sector comes in. So somebody from the private sector really has to put up their hand and say, hey guys, I know how SyncPass works and I can deploy it for you. I will update it for you. I have the local governance for it and you don't need to worry. So I think the trust and that the private sector will bring in and bridge the gap between the government requirements and what this brings. And so the second point is to what Shalini said, while cloud is definitely the way to go, the question is, would the cloud providers also take the responsibility of the solution being deployed? Are they giving DPI as a service, or are they just enabling the infrastructure? And going forward, between the cloud provider and the solution provider, a joint solution should come up where they take up the responsibility of providing that particular DPI as a service and thereby bridging the trust deficit at the government, whether it requires one or more organizations to partner together and create. And bottom line of this is that when this service is being put together, who's funding for it? Because market will take some time to develop. So how do you align your funding for these kinds of associations to come up, for these kinds of sandboxes to be put up by the private sector for government to evangelize? So I think in my sense, again, these are the three elements of what could make this work for the government. Thank you.
No, thanks, Rakesh. And I think there's a different discussion to be had about licensing, pricing, recovery of costs, which is obviously a key one when it comes back to Alistair's question of sustainability. I mean, unless philanthropists and donors are going to do this for the next 100 years, which I doubt very much. But as we turn back to NS and Murthy on the same question of deployment, and NS, maybe I could just push you on deployment a little bit further even, is saying is that essentially what I'm getting from this conversation is perhaps what we're looking at over the next 3 to 6 to 9 months is a new ecosystem of access providers, system integrators, consults, local SIs, and DPG asset holders, whether DPG asset holders are in India, whether they're in Brazil, whether they're in Singapore, and thinking about certification, empanelment, constant knowledge transfer, debugging, etc. So that's the world that we seem to be looking at. Unbundle that for us in over the next couple of minutes, if you can, please.
Thanks. Thanks, Rudra. So let me actually build a couple of points before I come to the question, Rudra. One is, I think, irrespective of whether the today having a policy or not, I think every single DPI implementation should take care of the data policy. It will be, if not today, tomorrow they will come with the data residency policy. So it's not up for a discussion that today we should actually think about a policy or we should actually do a multi-country, multi-tenancy cloud model. It will not actually be very frugal going forward. So it will actually require a lot of effort on the policy. So two of the things that needs to be actually taken care of if you need to build an agile.
Sorry, Edison, I'm just gonna stop you for a second because of your volume again. Could I ask you to maybe just turn off the video? It may help. Yeah. Maybe it's a bandwidth issue.
Is it better?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm just saying that I think the two of the things, most important things that needs to be picked up before we actually create an agility in the deployment is the policy and the procurement. Because you can't actually work on a deployment unless or until you have solved the procurement part of it. And both are at the local stage. They are not actually a kind of an international discussion or a G2G discussion. Yes, there are places where we can actually have a G2G consultation and Ministry of External Affairs coming in, supporting the other countries. But end of the day, the procurement has to be a local procurement because it needs to follow certain guidelines. So every country which needs to adopt a DPI needs to have a proper procurement system and the policy. If they do that in the first place, which is, in fact, it's not even for India also, by the way. If it is done, then it solves tons of other issues later on. Who actually deploys it? Can I actually get a kind of a ecosystem who's actually going to test the product? Can I actually take a cloud? How do I actually run it? What is the kind of procurement process or methodologies? All those, who is going to fund it? Everything gets imbibed in that Bible. Okay, so that's a part one. Part two is, and we have experienced this firsthand nowadays, is the experience part of it. Irrespective of what DPG or DPI is, it's the local citizens who needs to actually see the entire application from a usability standpoint, from a adoption standpoint. So the experience is becoming very, very important now. So there is if not less, not more, but at least there is a amount of customization which needs to be understood to make sure that entire thing is that. So when I unbundle this, there is elements of product development, continuous testing, support, a mechanism to actually continue to deliver versions after versions, do the capacities, technical, all these things can be done at a global level in a collaborative way. Whereas at the local level, you need to actually get the usability engineers, you need to get the engineering systems, you need to have the local, what you call the experience team to start building and making sure that DPI and DPG is used by the citizen or the end user in that country. Because otherwise, if it is something which is a lift and shift, it will never will be accepted and adopted in that country in a large scale. And the last one is, I think, and Shalini touched on that, is very importantly is the cyber security of that. Today I'll just put my neck into this and say that today it's not the focus of the cyber security or the threats. But as soon as the multiple countries start talking about sharing DPIs and DPGs, it will become the center of the attraction for all the threats. Okay, so you are actually looking at this, and this could be one collaborative both at the global level and at the local level, the cyber security mechanism. How do we protect the DPI installations? Because the fast replication depends upon how best we actually protect these assets at each and every country.
No, thanks, Anderson. That's I think bringing this conversation down to, a lot of us are thinking about plug and play, but bringing it down to realities on the ground, to questions of adoption, questions of perhaps cultural sensitivities, data protection. I think that compact we need to think through more and all of us do it together. But perhaps that takes us to Rohini, and perhaps cybersecurity is a nice segue. Is a lot of countries on the demand side, some of that will be solved because if you've got the private sector coming in, you have your contract with the private sector that assures that. And that's where the trust gets built, which is what I think Rakesh was alluding to. But your views on deploying DPI, deployment at scale, is cloud the way forward? And any kind of thoughts on what more we should be doing as far as
I don't know if it's just me, but Rudra, your last couple of microseconds went off, but I will still kind of do some, I'll fill in the blanks there. Yes, I think so. So a couple of things, right? In my mind, I began to think as I was listening to all my colleagues here is how do we think sort of customer first? Basically think about the country that is looking to adopt DPG, DPIs and really think about what are they thinking about in the sense of how are they feeling that this DPG, DPI that you are trying to deploy, by the word deploy itself has a connotation to it, right? But that you're trying to sort of offer is going to help them grow economically, socially, in every way, right? And I think that fundamentally, if you think about it from that perspective, the cloud is just an enabler. I think the reason one thinks about the cloud is that you want the private sector to innovate. You want the private sector to have access to digital infrastructure, digital platforms that they can scale with. Now, the question that you raised, and so the innovation becomes the primary part. I think the other part that you were talking about regarding, and the comment also came up regarding data residency, etc., and sovereignty and security. Those are actually very critical parts. And one thinks about the fact that the idea of data sovereignty and the idea of residency, these are issues that the cloud providers, like all of us here on the call, are thinking very deeply about, because there are hybrid clouds, there are technologies like confidential computing, there are technologies like sovereign landing zones, which are exactly to address the issue of sovereignty and scale, and the idea that you cannot have cybersecurity in the pace at which digital world is moving and the trillions of signals that most of the cloud providers are seeing. You just cannot replicate that at every data center. So I think the ability to think about the end customers, the end country's long-term interest is what drives actually the need for the cloud. The last one I would put forth is just pure economics. If the entire world, every small country were to build data centers, and we all went down that way, I think the marginal whatever dollar, rupee, etc., your favorite currency is, I think we would be doing the entire globe a serious disfavor in terms of the right way to even spend that money.
And I think that's a really powerful point that needs to be emphasized. I had a clever question about what's your favorite DPI, but I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and I'm not going to ask you that question. Although I'd love to kind of find out at some point, but I'm going to hand it back to Pramod. And Pramod, you were the chief architect of Aadhaar, of India Stack, of DPI frameworks in general. You've got all the thinking now happening over here. You've got all the brainstorming, and now we look to you to basically architect the next solution, which is deployment, or rather the offer that is going to be made to the next 100 countries. So with that, back to you, Pramod.
Thank you, Rudra. It's been fascinating to listen. Very aligned in many ways, that trying to do it from scratch, trying to build data centers or trying to custom install is just painfully slow, and countries have dire needs. So I think we must find a way to package this well, offer it well, and as much shared, reusable in one sense, packages as possible. But Rakesh's and NSN's points about context matters, and it is about different countries have different priority, different context, different culture, different setup, legal governance setups. So I think we have to understand those nuances and still allow some contextualization, if I generally use that word. So if I can package it but still get some contextualization run, it'll definitely fast track. I mean, it can't harm. I think the way we might want to look at it, would it solve everything? No. But would it compress the timeline of 1 or 2 years or 3 years to maybe 1 year? Sure, we can do that. I think that may be one way to look at it. And one way to look at it and say, don't go through this 2-3 years of long plan. By the time the AI has changed, world has changed, everything has changed. Maybe you can try something faster and try and learn and adapt, and something faster to 6 months to 1 year. Maybe look at that point of view. But again, thank you so much for being here, spending this time. I know it's late for some of you. Truly appreciate that time. I'll hand it over to Alok.